The dog looked into the storm drain every day, and when it was opened, people were shocked. Every day, this dog stared intently into a storm drain, refusing to leave its side. When it was finally opened, what people discovered inside left them completely stunned. In many countries, stray dogs are a common sight, but one dog, in particular, captured people's attention with its unusual behavior. In Turkey, a shaggy, unkempt stray pup wandered the streets, unknowingly about to become the center of an incredible story. This was part of his daily routine, wandering the streets in search of any scraps of food or water he could find. The day had started like any other, with the dog happily trotting along the road, wagging his tail at anyone who glanced his way. Despite his life as a stray, he was incredibly friendly and always eager for a pat from passersby. As the dog wandered down a familiar street, a delicious scent suddenly caught his attention. Following his nose, he soon found himself outside a butcher's shop. Peering through the window, he watched as customers purchased thick cuts of meat for their meals. The sight alone reminded him of just how hungry he was, and his stomach let out a loud, desperate growl. Inside the shop, a young woman called Annie was finishing paying for a couple of large steaks. Once she was done, she thanked the butcher and made her way out of the shop. Once outside, Annie started walking down the street towards her home. When, all of a sudden, she heard a loud gurgle and a whimper, the confused young woman turned around only to see the stray dog looking back at her with very sad eyes. Once again, the canine's stomach growled, and Annie knew then what the problem was. The dog was clearly a stray, and a very hungry one at that. Seeing the hungry animal, Annie immediately felt bad for it. She looked down at the steaks that she had just bought before marching back into the butcher's and asking for any cutoffs or bones that the man wouldn't sell. The butcher happily gave the woman what she wanted. Annie exited the shop and looked around for the stray dog. She soon found him watching her from a distance. The woman crouched down on the floor and carefully held out the bone that she had gotten for him. At first, the dog was cautious and didn't want to get too close to the woman, but the longer that she held the food out to him, the less the animal could resist creeping closer to get the meal. Finally, Annie managed to gain enough of the animal's trust that he started wagging his tail and accepted the large bone off of her. But instead of eating the food right then and there, the dog picked it up and began walking off as if he had somewhere to be. Confused about the canine's reaction, but not wanting to question it too much, Annie simply stood back up and made her way back home. The next day, Annie was walking down the street. When she noticed the same stray dog from yesterday, the animal seemed to have noticed her as well, and came happily bounding up to the woman with its tail wagging. Annie smiled at the dog's enthusiasm for her and began to fuss over him. Unfortunately, the young woman had places to be, so she couldn't spend too much time with the animal. Before she left, though, she made sure to buy the dog some sausages from a nearby shop. But once again, the dog didn't eat them straight away and instead walked off again. Annie was curious about the animal's behavior. However, she didn't have time to follow him and had to go about her day instead. On the third day, Annie once again found the stray dog. Only this time, it looked like he was waiting for her. The woman had started carrying treats in her bag in the hope that she would be able to give them to the poor stray. The young woman smiled as she approached the dog, and she gave him the treats that she had. This time, when the dog turned around and walked away though, Annie began to follow him. They eventually came to a busy street and Annie watched as the shaggy dog made his way over to a storm drain. The dog sat down next to the drain and looked down into it. He then dropped one of the treats that Annie had just given him into it before eating his own. The young woman was very confused. Just what was the dog doing? For the next few days, Annie would find the dog sitting and staring into the storm drain. Every time that she brought the animal some treats, he would always drop half of the food into the drain before eating his own share. Eventually, Annie became so curious that she decided to go and take a look for herself as to what was so interesting in the drain. But she never expected what she found. Annie crept over to the storm drain, wary of the dog who was standing guard next to it. But the canine simply watched the young woman curiously. Once Annie was directly above the drain, she looked down into it and gasped at what she saw. Immediately, the young woman reached for her phone and called the fire department. She would definitely need their help. Roughly half an hour later, a couple of firemen showed up and asked the woman what was wrong. Annie explained to them what she had seen, and the men quickly got to work. They walked over to the storm drain, but at that moment, the stray dog began to growl at them. Not wanting to be bitten, the firemen stopped. They didn't know what to do, but luckily Annie did. She carefully walked up to the dog, reassuring the animal that the men were only there to help. She then held a treat out to the canine, and when he finally approached her to take it, she grabbed hold of him to keep him away from the drain and the firemen. With the stray out of the way, the firemen got to work opening the storm drain up. By this point, because the drain was in the middle of a busy street, a crowd had formed around the firemen to see what they were doing. After a few tense minutes, the firemen finally revealed what the stray dog had been so focused on inside the drain. In one of the firemen's arms was a tiny kitten. All of the bystanders were shocked, but that wasn't the end of it. The firemen ducked back into the storm drain 4 more times. Each time he came up, another kitten was in his arms. Annie was astounded at what she was witnessing. She knew that something was down there, as she had seen it when she peeked in. But she had no idea that 5 tiny and adorable kittens had been stuck. At that moment, the stray dog managed to wriggle his way out of Annie's arms and bounded over to the fireman who had the kittens. As soon as the dog saw the small felines, he immediately began to wag his tail and sniff at them. The kittens mewed back at the canine. Annie walked over to the firemen and asked them just how such young kittens ended up in such a predicament. The fireman told her that it was likely they were swept into the drain during heavy rain. But considering that they had been trapped, they weren't starving. At this piece of information, Annie looked over at the stray dog. She realized that the kittens had survived thanks to Benny's selflessness, sharing his food with them each day. Moved by his kindness, Annie knew exactly what she had to do. She told the firefighter that she would take the kittens home and care for them until they were ready for adoption. He agreed, gently handing the tiny felines over to her. As the young woman started heading home, she turned back and called out to the stray dog, "Come on, Benny. It's time to go home." The dog's tail wagged excitedly as he bounded toward her. Annie cared for all the kittens, nurturing them until they were old enough to leave. When the time came, she found 4 of them loving homes, ensuring they would be well cared for. She kept 1 kitten for herself, having grown deeply attached to them. Benny also found his forever home, as Annie couldn't bear to leave the shaggy dog on the streets after all he had done for the tiny felines. Together, they became a family, living happily with no fear of ever being homeless again. Annie loved them too much to let them go, and in return, Benny and Fudge the cat adored her just as much. What an incredible story! If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. See you in the next video.